This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am your host, Gilad Harper. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy. Every year, the IDI publishes the Democracy Index, a comprehensive study of Israeli public opinion on matters of public importance. And this year, 2022, it marks its 20th edition. And to this end, we are delighted to have back with us in the studio the woman who has long been in charge of the Democracy Index, Professor Tamar Hermann, who is a senior fellow at the IDI and a professor of political science at the Open University. Tamar Hermann, welcome back to the studio.
Thank you, Gilad.
So the new Israeli government is the most right-wing in its history. This is something that we hear several times a day by now. And my question to you is it the culmination of trends we've seen over the years? Is the government an accurate reflection of the views held by the Israeli public and being strengthened over the years?
Okay, because of the Israeli specific electoral system, no government is a pure reflection of what's happening on the grassroots level or the citizenry level. However, we did see in the past a growing support of the public or self-positioning of the public on the right side of the political map, although it was not immediately reflected in their decision for what party to vote. And indeed, it also have to do with the fact that the Israeli political map is divided into three, and for the Jewish public, for the Arab citizens, it's a totally different opera.
Is it a fourth one?
It's something different.
Okay.
Certain scholars tend to unite the Israeli Jewish left with the Arab public electoral preferences. I prefer not to do that, and I can explain in a minute why. But if we look at the Jewish public only, and we try to figure out what are the proportions in recent years, and I'm saying in recent years because it is not a very recent development. Over 7 or 8 years, we see a slight movement content-wise, not necessarily electorally-wise immediately, to the right. So in recent years, what we actually have is about 60-something% of our interviewees, and this is, of course, a representative sample of the entire Jewish population, aged 18 and above. We see around 60% putting themselves on the right. We have about 25 to 30% who put themselves in the center. And in a good day, we have 12 to 13% who put themselves on the left. It is important to say that our interviewees are actually doing it by themselves. It is not that we take their electoral choices and decide where to put them. In other words, sometimes we have people, and certainly in the recent elections, there were people who put themselves, say, on the right, but for a very specific reason, and this is their reservations with Netanyahu's court case and Dizzy first, that they actually voted center. So they define themselves as right-wingers, but they voted center. And this is why we do not do this translation for them. We do not say if you voted for a center party, we will put you at the center.
But the interesting thing, and I think the Democracy Index gets at always very accurately, is that there is always a discrepancy between voting patterns or even how people define themselves and what views they believe in. So I'm talking about substantively in terms of views that are championed by the far-right parties that are now about to form the government. Is there more support, for example, for judicial reform in a way that would weaken and perhaps invalidate entirely the Supreme Court? Other laws that would give the executive more powers. These are things that substantively are associated with the right-wing policy today. Has there been a growing support for these policies?
These policies are issues that are less thought about by the average citizen than other issues which actually determine their self-positioning. I'll get back to your question about these laws in a minute.
Okay.
What makes people locate themselves on this side or on that side is mainly the issue of the identity of the state and themselves in this context. Is this a Jewish state or a democratic state? And those who think that the state should be more Jewish, and this has to do with the status of the Israeli Arab citizens, it has to do with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it has to do with state and religion matters. These are the more important issues that affect people's preference of being wherever. The issues that you've just raised, to start with, they are very complicated. For example, should the Supreme Court has the authority to abolish laws or to put a question mark on laws that were enacted by the parliament? It's a matter of, I would say, better knowledge and also some kind of a decision where the limit is. For example, almost everyone will agree that if, say, this law would be accepted by 80% of the members of Knesset, then it would be more difficult for the Supreme Court to say it's not okay from the democratic point of view. Now, the question is 61 enough? And here you find the people of the right.
61 majority.
A 61 majority. Here you'll find the people who define themselves as being on the right. They will say 61 is enough, 65 is enough. But if you say 80% or 80 members of Knesset or 90 members of Knesset, you'll find there many people of the center and even of the left. So it is not clear.
Because in the report I saw that there isn't a clear majority for judicial reform among the Israeli public, which is something that I was surprised to see. I mean, it's the opposition to it is much weaker than before, but still there's no majority. And also there is a majority of people that think that the balance between Jewish and democratic tilts towards Jewish. It doesn't mean they can think that it's a good thing, but it's not necessarily what drives them politically. Because if they thought that the Jewish element needs to be strengthened, then I'd say okay, it means that they wanted to vote right. But that is not necessarily the case. So going back to what you said earlier about how they perceive themselves politically on this spectrum between Jewish and democratic. So would you say that the current expression, the current election results, the most far-right majority in parliament ever, could it be a backlash response to the previous government that had an Arab party in it, and therefore that rallied many of these people who thought that Israel's Jewish element has to be strengthened and might be eroding?
For sure. It's a combination of the fact that for the first time ever we had an Israeli Arab party in the coalition. We never had any, even during Rabin's term that everyone is praising for incorporating the Arabs into the decision-making processes. But he didn't have an Arab party on board. They served as a safety net for him. And he, of course, communicated with them. He discussed issues with them. But he didn't have them in his coalition, while the Bennett-Lapid government indeed gave them the formal status of being members of the coalition. So this is one. But then we had the May 2021 events in the mixed cities when we had violent clashes between Jews and Arabs and Jews. And this was, I would say, a turning point in the relations between the Jewish majority and the Arab minority. Of course, it influenced in the negative sense more those who put themselves at the center and on the right. But I would say it's a combination of the events and our party in the coalition. But it is more than that. It also has to do with the strengthening of nationalistic tendencies in certain parts of Israeli society that in the past were not that keen on these kind of agenda. For example, young people who define themselves as secular. In the past, we got used to having their young people who belong to the national religious or national Orthodox sector of Israeli society, more and more so on the ultra-Orthodox Haredi sector of the Israeli society. But we didn't see so many young people who define themselves as secular holding to these kind of views. And in recent years, we see this subsector growing, taking also into consideration the fact that prior to the last elections, Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the leaders of the religious Zionist party, this was a very clever move by him and by Smotrich to actually hijack the name of the entire sector as the name of the specific party. He managed to project a sense of being anti-establishment person, one that doesn't play by the rules of the established political system and parties, and young people like that.
Would you say that he's Israel's first, I'd say, successful populist leader in this sense?
Well, you know that throughout the literature of the very recent years, the term populism is now being put under a question mark, to which extent we have one term that explains it all. But in certain respects, I will say that he adopted some of the more significant features of populist parties, because we could find in the past some populist rhetoric in the Likud and in other parties.
Not just in the past.
Yeah, but at that time we tended to point to them as the epitome of populism. And now, as paradoxical as it may sound, Netanyahu is the most leftist person in his own government.
Yeah.
So things are changing.
I said some time ago that the funny thing about the pendulum theory is that it doesn't apply to Israel. Whenever it swings to the right, it can always swing more to the right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it also has to do with the birth rate, because we know that there is a very strong connection between people's self-definition on the continuum between secular and ultra-Orthodox, and their self-positioning on the continuum between left and right. On the right side, or amongst the ultra-Orthodox and the national religious, almost 100% put themselves on the right. Maybe the soft right, but on the right. So as the birth rate is much higher than amongst the traditionalists, certainly the traditionalists who are not religious and the secular, then I don't see the possibility of the pendulum, if there is any, to go back, because amongst the secular, it's 2.9 kids per family, whereas amongst the ultra-Orthodox, it's 6.8, and amongst the national Orthodox or national religious, it's 5.8. So if we look at the future, and if these things, of course, they are not deterministic, but they do not change from today to tomorrow, then and we know that young people in Israel tend to stay politically where their parents are, also geographically, but also politically. So the chances that in the foreseeable future we will see a switch to the left are very minor.
Yeah.
But miracles do happen.
No, it has to do, well, if we stay on that for a second, I think that it has to do with political coalitions rather than voting patterns. I mean, when there will be, if there is any kind of a veritable connection between the center and the center left and the Arab electorate, the same way, for example, that the Democratic Party in the United States did in the 1960s when they started embracing minorities. Then, once they did that, demography started playing in their favor.
Right, but there is a problem here, and this is why I said previously that the Arabs actually do not belong to the center and center left in Israel, and this is the issue of Zionism, because even on the left, Zionism is I would say, the basis for their political vision for the future, right? Whereas the Arabs are less and less fascinated with the idea of joining forces with parties that, even if they advocate giving them more rights and being more compromising as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned, but even the left is actually demanding them to acknowledge that this is the nation state of the Jewish people.
Yeah. Well, as you said, miracles do happen, and
sometimes,
and it applies to both. It applies both ways. I mean, the way that the center-left treats the Arab electorate and the way the Arab electorate treats center-left parties. But I would like to stay on the center-left for a second and ask you about the outgoing government, the Lapid-Bennett government, that served as some sort of a rare outlier because for the first time in certainly more than a decade, but second time in the 20 years that the Democracy Index exists, we had a government that was not run by Likud. And some of the findings were utterly fascinating in the way that it was the sentiments of people were translated based on their support or opposition to the government. So when their people were in government, suddenly they were happy with the situation in Israel, and suddenly they had faith in state institutions, etc., and vice versa. So Likud supporters thought the country is going down the drain for the 18 months of the Lapid-Bennett government, and suddenly, hop, the minute Netanyahu is back in power, everything is hunky-dory again. That is utterly fascinating.
This is because Israeli society is a highly politicized society. Actually, when we meet someone whom we do not know, we will try immediately to figure out where is this person located politically, because even the chit-chat on a very trivial matters go through this perspective. You think twice before you talk about the West Bank or Judea and Samaria without knowing who the person is. You use a different vocabulary when this person is identified as your peer in terms of his or her political views. So it goes through the prism of the political location much more than in other countries, besides, for example, Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, I felt at home because this is exactly the case there. It has to do with religion, of course, if you are a Protestant or Catholic, and it has to do with everything. So as we are highly politicized, much more than in the United States or in most other European Western countries, but we can find it, as I said, in Northern Ireland, but also in India, if you're a Muslim or a Hindu. So these issues are an essential part of your personality. And this is why people look at issues like, is security well served by this government or not? And we found out a flip there, that the day that Bennett took the position of Israel's prime minister, people of the right, out of a sudden, authentically felt that their security is now on a much lower level than it used to be a week before, when Netanyahu was still the prime minister, because Netanyahu is Mr. Security, and no one else can serve the interests of Israel as well as he. And the opposite happened on the left, because the left that is now depressed for, say, at least a decade, if not more, have become much more optimistic about everything, about security, about the economy, and you just name it. And it's really absurd in a way, because nothing changed in terms of Israel's security and Israel's economy. And it only tells you that things are not based on a careful analysis of the facts. And of course, this goes hand in hand with the entire global issue of fake news. Your echo chamber creates a situation in which your beliefs are being strengthened without being challenged at all, because you're not exposed to anything. So this connection that we spoke about between political positioning, level of religiosity, socioeconomic background, what we see is what we call parallel cleavages rather than cross-cutting cleavages. And this is why we can actually guess quite accurately a person's political views, but by looking at him and by talking for 3, 4, 5 minutes.
That is because, unlike in the United Kingdom, for example, we don't have regional accents. Because, George Bernard Shaw famously said that an Englishman cannot open his mouth without another despising him. So in the United Kingdom, the minute you open your mouth and your accent comes out, people position you. And here you have to do a political chit-chat for a bit to find out what this...
Yes and no, because, you have some kind of now with the King's English, right? Mm-hmm. That is being spoken more by, say, Ashkenazi upper middle class, educated. Do we have that in Israel? Yeah. I mean, it's not clear cut like in other countries. But for example, Mizrahi accent is something that is highly noticeable while saying few words. Russian accent. So it's not geographical, but it is more, I would say, class-related, education-related, and so on.
All right, let's not go there. I'd like to ask you, you mentioned the echo chamber and the fact that, there's a lot of that going on. And I want to ask you about the role of, again, populist rhetoric in all that. Because one of the findings that I did find also interesting was that there was, over the recent years, a sharp decline in trust, specifically in the Supreme Court. So from 60% overall to 40% among Jews in 2022. So that's a sharp decline. And also in the media, that was already rather low, 37 overall to 22% in 2022. And that decline was really over the last decade or so. So from 2014, we see this free fall. And that runs in parallel to such developments as Netanyahu's ongoing campaign against the judicial system and the media for his own reasons, whether it's his criminal case and other political reasons. But the question is, to what extent can you tell on whether whether it's a chicken and egg? Right? Are these sentiments, do they emanate from below and trickle up to the leadership, to Netanyahu and his cronies, or to what extent do they come from above and trickle down to the people?
It's a two-way street or way. Netanyahu is the best analyst of Israeli politics and Israeli public opinion, regardless of what I think of him on other issues. He senses very correctly, and he also, he's doing lots of focus groups and private surveys in order to figure out what are the soft points in the Israeli psyche. And he addresses them in a very skillful way. So, of course, he would not take something that would not resonate with a large part of the Israeli public and with his constituency. And sometimes he gets some signals from these focus groups and he uses them if it doesn't go against his general agenda. Okay, but I wouldn't put all the responsibility on him. I mean, in a way, we are giving him or attributing to him much more power over people's minds because Israelis are basically quite suspicious. It's in Hebrew, I don't know how to say it in English, but in Hebrew we say it's an am kshe oref. It's a people that is very difficult to mobilize for whatever, and this is why Jews do not have a pope. It is said, "Aseh lecha rav."
Make your own rabbi.
So he has to work pretty hard, or I would put it in a different way. In the past, he had to work pretty hard to actually solidify his constituency. In recent years, he is much helped by the center and the center left that demonized him, and this immediately boomeranged amongst people who considered him to be a good leader. So from a good leader, he has become in his constituency's eyes as a victim of the old elites, of the liberal circles who work through this judiciary. So this loss of confidence or trust in the judiciary has to do with the perception that the judiciary is not clean-handed and professional, that actually they are serving an agenda that infiltrated to the Supreme Court from the enemies of Netanyahu. So it is not the Supreme Court per se, it is the Supreme Court as representing something that is looked upon as very political. Once it was painted with a political color, the ability to despise them has become much easier.
Yeah, right. One of the interesting methodological points that you make is that you are trying to address, as you have for a long time, the difficulty of explaining the left-right divisions in Israel that never apply. You have to explain that it's all about security matters and etc. And what you take into account here is one variable, that is a feeling of belonging to a stronger or weaker group in society. You use that in your surveys to again try to pinpoint the person on the a global political layout of the society. Can you develop on that?
We try to find a variable besides level of religiosity, which I already mentioned, that will help us to understand why people feel as part of a minority, although they are part of the majority. And it has to do with their socioeconomic status, with the education, and so on and so forth. So in the past, we tried to use these variables that are well known in the literature. For example, how would you define your class? Are you a working class, middle class? But the absolute majority in Israel put themselves in the middle class. So it is not usable, because if everyone there, then it is not a discriminant factor, right? And then we tried education. Education is filtered through level of religiosity much more strongly than in other places. So we thought about developing a variable that will bring together people's sense of marginality or centrality in the society. Of course, it is connected to their income, their education, their ethnic origin, and so on and so forth. So we tried it in the past to ask them about their location. There is this very well-known theory of Edward Shills about center and periphery, not in geographical terms, but in the structure of society. Do you feel that you are part of the center, or do you feel that you are part of the periphery? Which means, can you approach, for example, people of power? Do you have influence over what's happening in the country? Do you feel part of what is happening in here? And we found out that it's a very good explaining factor. And people
for Jews, though, isn't it? Because I would say that the cleavage between Jews and Arabs on that is obvious, isn't it?
Yes, but it is less, I would say, significant than we expected it to be, because we found out that Israeli society is a multi-center society. So certain Arabs, for example, who may be thought of as at the very far periphery, if they are very close to their own society's center, they'll put themselves closer to the center than by the objective so-called factors as income, education, and whatever. If my cousin is the deputy mayor in my township, then I may feel very close to the center and much more powerful than my objective characteristic would indicate.
Really interesting. Also, looking back on the last couple of years, another factor that really determined every walk of life, certainly politically, and also on questions, specifically on questions of trust in the government and state institutions, was COVID. What effect did you observe when it comes to COVID on people's relationship with political power?
I would use past tense here, because COVID is not part of the political discussion here or discourse here anymore in the last year and a half or 2 years. In the past, indeed, we saw that people were less trustful of the government, depending on the positioning. For example, the ultra-Orthodox have lost much of the trust in the government because of the clashes that we saw in the past between the government regulations and the resistance to these regulations. Also, the Arabs felt that they were blamed for, contaminating the public sphere because they did not observe everything that was planned by the government and so on and so forth. But nowadays, neither the Israeli-Palestinian conflict nor COVID are part of the discourse. It may sound very, very strange to people from the outside.
So it didn't have any long-lasting effects?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Not directly, but indirectly. Once you lose trust, it's very difficult for the authorities to rebuild the trust, even if COVID is already
So that is something that you did observe?
Yes, we did, but we cannot... we don't have causal relations that can be proven that this is the reason for. But we saw it all over the world. People lost trust in the governments. And what's most interesting is that it doesn't have to do with the quality of the democracy in the various countries. Level of trust is not directly connected to the regime type.
This is all very fascinating, and the Democracy Index will be available very soon in English as well, for all our listeners to delve deep into the many, 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 many fascinating insights about trends in the Israeli society. Professor Tamar Hermann, Senior Fellow at the IDI and Professor of Political Science at the Open University. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the IDI for their generous support. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review, good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 800 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Follow me and the podcast on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.